Shall we start?
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. So I have a few questions like when a candidate attending an interview. So what a recruiter look at the candidate, or let's say the first impression they do is the shortlisting of resumes.
Yeah.
So how important is a resume, and what they look in the resume that they will shortlist some candidates, but not all or few.
Got it. Thanks, Maniv. Let me start from there. So I think where resumes are concerned, right? I think the first point for it would be that the resume is first and foremost a point of elimination as much as it's a point of selection. So what do I mean by that, right? If you've got basic things like grammatical errors, spelling mistakes, or bad formatting, that's the first thing which will put off a recruiter, right? Because when you've got so many resumes to go through, if the first look itself is like this is crowded, I'm not able to read what is there, then the recruiter switched off then and there itself, and you can forget about the shortlist actually even happening. So once that first filter has been cleared, so that the resume has a good level of hygiene in terms of formatting, grammar, English, all of those things. The second level is then for relevance. So I think the idea is depending on the role you're applying for, whether it's as a software engineer, whether it's as a QA tester, whether it's as a salesperson, whether it's as an operations person, any kind of role. I think having a resume relevant to that particular company's job description and the company itself is the second level, right? Because while I'm shortlisting, when I'm looking for a resume, depending on whether it's a fresher versus a few years of experience or a lot of experience, I'm basically looking for what kind of experience does this person have, or what are those markers which make this person relevant to the role I'm hiring for or the company I'm hiring for. So these would just be a couple of pointers. A, make sure that your resume is clean so that doesn't get rejected upfront. And B, make sure it's customized so that you know that the content over there is relevant to the role you're applying for and the company you're applying for.
Awesome. So it's like mostly the readability and the relevance of to the position which they're applying.
Absolutely.
So other than these, are there any things that very common to in every resume that any recruiter look at?
Sure. So let me customize this a little bit, right? That can vary by the type of role, the type of company, and the level of experience which is there for a particular role, right? So let me start with probably the crowd. So for if I'm a fresher, I can imagine everybody's asking this question saying, I'm a fresher, what can I put in my CV, which will make it interesting for a company, right? So the obvious thing is people can talk about their college, their marks and things like that. So if you're lucky enough and you worked hard enough to have good marks, so that's something you should absolutely show off. If you're like me and you don't have very good marks, then you need to find other things to put on your CV, right? So I think what helps is, for example, I know a lot of younger folks right now are going out in the market to do live projects or to do, for example, internships with companies. So I think that's the closest a fresher can do in terms of putting something relevant on their CV. It also shows a great level of intent saying they're working hard to learn new experiences. A second thing, as a fresher, I would put, even if it's things I've done in college over and above my studies, that's relevant for a lot of companies. That shows that you have an intent to have a more holistic learning, and hence you might be somebody who can gel well in a company culturally also. So one small example is a lot of consulting companies, for example, love people who are very strong in sports, for example, or very strong in dramatics, because they find that more holistic people are great while connecting with clients, right? And
Okay.
similarly, if you're applying for a tech job, for example, are you contributing on GitHub? Are you sort of working towards open source projects? A lot of these things show your interest in the kind of work that you're going to do. So I'd say that is for our freshers probably the best thing they could do. For more experienced candidates, I'd say a couple of things, right? One is the most recent experience you've had. It's usually a good idea to talk about that, because most people tend to talk to you about your last one job or two jobs, or your last one role or two roles, right? Because that's what's most
Mhm.
fresh in memory and things like that. Or alternatively, if there's any particular role which you've done previously which has the most relevance to the one you're applying to, I think it's great to talk about that in a lot more detail, which will usually revolve around what was your responsibility and what is the impact you created in that responsibility, show that you're actually good at your job. So I'd say these are a couple of tips probably from a more experienced candidate standpoint.
Awesome. So one thing I even don't know that extracurricular activity showing that on a resume does matter. Like, and you spoke about experience. Like, so the last job experience is important, or like some experienced candidate might have 2-3 jobs done before. So showing all those things are important, or the last one is important. Like how relevant is the last few jobs?
So one is, I think, just making sure your entire experience is captured is important. So I think one thing is, just because a company or a job wasn't super relevant to what you're going to be doing next doesn't mean it's not important, because it adds to your experience, how you work with people and things like that. So it's important to talk about all of your experience. But let's say if you've got X amount in your CV, I would dedicate like at least half, if not more, to the most relevant job or the most recent job. And ideally, if your recent one is the most relevant one, then make sure you talk about that the most. The others can be mentioned in like a 1-2 point kind of detail. But if I had to pick which to index on, most recent and most relevant.
Okay, and one more thing is like when we are applying for a position, and we know that position has demands some experience, and if we have experience from different backgrounds or different sectors, like, so do we have to put them forward, or like how much value it adds to a resume, or how it will impress the recruiter?
So that's actually a very interesting point, right? So if it is about how do I know how to tailor my CV and to sell to a company, because what we're doing is selling ourselves as potential candidates for a company, right? I think the first pointer which we can take is actually the job description. Now, a lot of large companies have very detailed job descriptions. They've got their systems and processes. So if the job description is saying looking for X years of relevant experience and Y years of total experience, then there's nowhere to hide, right? You need to show both things.
Yes.
Whereas some JDs, if they're not very detailed, they just say minimum 8 years of experience, minimum 2 years of experience. So if it's not, whether it's relevant or not is secondary. You just want to pass the first filter then, right? And the last piece is companies which basically don't write very detailed JDs, and this is very common for early stage startups, right? You can take Masai. A lot of our JDs are literally half pages, 1 pages, and things like that, right? So in that case, obviously, then the company is not giving you a lot of things. You can probably look up companies on Glassdoor. What are people looking for? If you look up a company on LinkedIn, for example, and if you were to look at the people, can you find people who are currently doing the job you're applying to? So then you can see what are their backgrounds and can I highlight something I've done similar to them. So just a few things people could do.
Yeah, that is an interesting answer. Like, yeah, that's good. So we started without introducing ourselves. I work at Masai School. Like I'm a developer, SD1. So I just want Anirudh to introduce yourself.
Sure. So again, my name is Anirudh. I lead the business vertical at Masai School. Before this, I've got about 11, 12 years of experience across a few different companies. I work with Target, with Shell. I spent almost 6 years with Swiggy, right from an early stage to a late stage. It took about a year to actually do an entrepreneurial stint with a few friends, which was also very rewarding. And again, it's been about 5-6 months now with Masai School. And more on a personal note, I think it's interesting. This conversation is you're coming from a technology background, me coming from as far away from a technology background as possible. So always useful to get different perspectives. And I think even when it comes to personal interest, right? I know you're a big fitness aficionado, and I enjoy things like reading books and also enjoy a few sports like football and whatnot. So it should be a fun chat.
Awesome. So I have one more question. Like recruiters ask hobbies and things related to non-technical, non-skill stuff. So they are not important for, according to me as a tech person. Like when they ask me those questions, I feel like it's not relevant. Like why do they want to know about my hobbies, my interest? How does it matter for a recruiter? And does it form any impressions, or like how do they shortlist based on that?
Got it. So for this, I'm just going to take a step back, right? So when somebody is recruiting, broadly, how are they deciding whether I like person A versus person B, right? So very directionally, at least three things if I have to pick. First thing you're checking is the skill fitment. Does the person have XYZ skills which will fit the role they're applying for, right? Very basic cut. Second, you're looking for is, does this person fit the culture of the place I'm hiring them for? The reason I say place is because it could be culture of the team, it could be culture of the company, it could even be something as basic as the fitment between the person and the manager. Because in an early stage company, if there's hardly 5-10 employees, you don't have a culture per se for the organization, right? So first was skill fitment, second was cultural fitment, and the third is actually the intent of the person on what role does my company play in your career, right? Because then I'll know, are you joining me just as a stepping stone to go to some other company? Are you likely to stay with me for 1-2 years? That's also important to me as a recruiter, right? So now coming back to your question is, with these three things in mind, firstly, not all companies will ask for your hobby. A company which is very indexed only on, I want skill fitment, I don't care about anything else, probably won't even ask you what your hobbies are, right? Or if they've run out of questions, but they have 10 minutes left on the interview, they might ask you, right? So that's just as a personal connect. But I think the companies to whom culture is very important and things like that, they're interested, assuming you've tick marked on the skill fitment. Then they want to know, are you the right fit for my company? So by asking you to talk about your hobbies, what comes out interestingly is then how passionate are you about something? And that's likely to reflect in your work also. And I can give a personal example. The first company I worked for was actually Target, and Target indexes heavily on culture. Like they have a very clear, distinct culture, and they're looking for people who fit that culture. So I was told afterwards that one of the reasons they hired me is when they asked me, what do you do in your free time? I spoke very passionately about football because that was my number one hobby at the time. And they said, if you bring that to something you're interested in, if you give you interesting work, we know you'll bring that to the work you do also. So that was a first-hand example of why a company appreciates your hobbies, but maybe not everybody will. People who want only your technical skills may not care.
Awesome. So when the recruiter or interviewer ask about our hobbies and interest, and sometimes not everyone, but we do exaggerate some things. So does it really helpful, or like it is like a misfire? Like,
Interesting. So again, it's important to understand why the person is asking you about your hobby, right? If it is, I'm just giving you an example, right? If it's a sales role or if it's a customer facing role, then how you describe your hobby is kind of part of selling yourself, right? And if you have done something, for example, somebody who's done national level swimming, somebody who's done quizzing at a state level. So if you've got an achievement to talk about, the good part is you should talk about it. Then you don't need to exaggerate anything because that already says how good you are at something. But if the question is just stemming from trying to figure out what are you interested in, who are you as a person, how good you are at it is not the most important thing. They're more interested on how much interest you take, how do you actually go about developing your interest, are you keen to learn, and how passionate are you? So in that case, why exaggerate how good you are at something? You might as well talk about how much you're interested in it. The flip side is if you're not really interested in it, don't go down that route because it'll come out very obviously if you're just trying to make it up. Because by
yes.
chance, if you say I love football and the person is also a very keen football aficionado, and they're like, oh, which club do you support? What position do you play? That can go downhill very quickly. So it's important to be genuine.
Yeah, this happens sometimes. Like, yeah, it's also, I feel like it's not just when we are attending any interview. It's not like the company, whether we fit in that culture of the company, or also it's like the both ways.
Yeah.
So it's better not to lie about anything and be genuine as you are. And if it is good, then you will be like you will be selected or something. And
100%. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
yeah. So is there a like, let's say, do a candidate has to impress the recruiter? Or some people think that if we impress the recruiter by saying something or by, is it needed really to impress the recruiter?
That's a very interesting question. I suspect if you ask this to 10 people, you'll get different answers. But let's break it down, right? If it comes down to a role where all that matters is your skill. Let's take, for example, a software engineering role. If all that matters is your technical capability, why even have an interview, right? We can give you a series of tests on a HackerRank, different portals, and if somebody shows their technical capability in actuality, right, in application, why even have an interview? But I think till now, of all the companies we speak to, I don't think there's a single company which hires without talking to the candidate, right? Which means who you are as a human being matters to people. It might matter a little bit or a lot, but it is important, right? So to take a question, is it important that I impress the recruiter, right? So I'd break into two parts, right? It does matter the impression you create, right, about who you are, which was the point you were mentioning about being genuine, right? And I'll use a line which Yogesh, our co-founder, always says, right? A lot about the interview is a transfer of confidence. It is my confidence in myself being transferred to you as a recruiter, and you having confidence in me. And that's another way for saying, how do I create an impression with a recruiter, right? And the impression you want to create can be different basis you as a person, can be different basis the company. So if it's an early stage startup, you might want to create the impression that you want to learn, you're happy to figure things out, that you're very energetic. Whereas if it's a larger company, for example, which are customer facing role, you might want to impress upon how you can handle yourself in a conversation, how you'd be a good person to talk to clients. So the impression you create might want to change, but whether you want to or not, the recruiter is going to have an impression about you. The question you want to ask yourself is, what direction do I want to create that impression?
I have one follow-up question. Like many do believe that. So there is always the first impression when a candidate comes, and if we mess up the first impression by doing something or making some wrong statement or something, is there a chance for the candidate to get selected by improving upon the next set of questions that recruiter asks? Can the first impression be like changed if it is bad?
Yeah. So actually, let's again break that down. Right? It's a great question. So one is the first impression. I'll answer like similar to the resume question, right? The first thing you have to do is not create a bad impression. So what can create a bad impression? If you come late to an interview, absolutely strict no. If you come in and then suddenly you're like, oh, I'm so sorry, my laptop is out of charge. Let me connect from my phone. All of those things. So the first thing you want to do is not create a bad impression. The second piece is then usually there will be an opening question, right? In anything, tell me about yourself. What you tell me about your experience. So that usually be an opening question, which I think is a great place to land that first impression. So you can control that. And what a lot of people don't realize is you think, this is an easy point. No, I can talk about myself all day. But being able to customize that to say, how long should I keep it? How short do I keep it? How do I customize it to the person I'm talking to, the company, etc. So that tell me about yourself question, surprisingly, a lot of people don't even practice. So that's in the first impressions piece. The second piece is, by chance, for some reason, your first impression goes wrong. I can actually share a personal example. So during my MBA campus placements, one of my dream companies where ironically my wife works, the company is Hindustan Unilever. I actually went for that interview and I messed up the second question I got asked. The first question was, tell me about yourself and all that. And he said, tell me the difference between sales and marketing. And I was going for a role which was a management training program, which should have sales and marketing. And I gave him some very like storybook answer, which I mugged up some 3 words and I put it because I wasn't mentally prepared for that. That question went downhill from there. So I obviously didn't get through that interview. So when you do make a difficult point, I think it's a little bit hard to come back from that. So it's important to practice first impressions, but it's not impossible. So, and I can give an example of a recent interview I was taking. So during that interview, I asked a person a question saying, why can you tell me about the role at Masai school and the Masai school? What do you know so far? And I'll build on that. And I got a 5-word answer. And they said, I'm so sorry, I didn't get enough time to look up the company. For me, that's a strict no-no, because if you've not taken the interest to look up a company, then why should I hire you? But the rest of the interview went so well, right? That the technical competence was there, and the energy with which she went into the interview to answer every single question, to find out more, to ask questions, showed me that maybe it wasn't a genuine interest problem, but it was a one-off instance. So it's definitely possible to overcome a first impression, but the fewer times you do that, the better.
So it's not like don't give up just if you mess up the first impression.
In the interview, if you know you messed up, the easiest thing is to get distracted by that. So you need to put it on and keep going.
Yeah, that is correct. So I feel like they can make the first impression little better by having good surroundings and lighting and everything.
100.
So how important is that? Like, what are the things that they have to consider before starting the interview, like before they get into a Zoom call or something?
Absolutely. And like you said, right, these are things which we call table stakes or foundation. And if the foundation of the interview isn't strong, nothing else can be built on top of it. Right? So some of the things you spoke about, the lighting behind you, the devices you're using, are they all charged and ready? The sort of audio which you have, can you practice it to make sure the other person can hear you clearly? Even just the clothes you're wearing, your grooming, all of these things. So I'd say the platform on which you're working, making sure audio, video, all of these things work well. Second is yourself in terms of how you present yourself. And the third is the surroundings which you have, right? Which you spoke about is the lighting which you have, the background which you have, is there a lot of background noise and things like that. So I say these are the 3 key areas to make sure you're not rejected in an interview before it even starts.
So the dressing also matters?
Absolutely, yeah. Because, and again, it varies, right? So like take you and me, like I can come in a shirt, you can come in a t-shirt, it would be vice versa. But if I'm going to a company whose dress code is formals, and if I go in a t-shirt, God help me, right? I'm not going to get through. But if I'm going to a company which is pretty relaxed about their dress code, it's not like I can wear one t-shirt with a hole over here which the interviewer can see, right? So absolutely important to have a presentable presence in the interview.
Yeah, so we have to show our intention to get through the interview by keeping all these things in check.
Definitely. And you're showing your seriousness and your intent that this interview is important to me because the other person's taking time out of the schedule to talk to you. And if that job is important to you, then you also need to make an effort. Yeah.
Yeah. I have one more question. So in an interview, it will be a very short time, 30 minutes or 60 minutes. So in that very short time, how can an interviewer judge the skills of a person? Because so we might not able to answer few things, but that doesn't mean that we don't know a lot of things. So we have any student, or let's say I might have studied a lot of things, and I am attending an interview and I don't know that one particular thing. And how do I handle it? So how can the interviewer judge all my knowledge in that 160 or 30 minutes session?
Fantastic. Great question, right? And that's one regular feedback we get from a lot of our students who are going through interviews on like how much role does luck play? How do I actually do the best in that, right? So to be very honest, for everybody's reference, right, luck plays some part in it, right? If there are 10 questions the interviewer could have asked you, on any given day, they might ask you 2 or 3 in that time. And you might know some questions better, you might not know some questions better. But I think the way you phrased it is absolutely right, right? How do I maximize my probability of getting through? So let's take a thing, right? So what is an interviewer looking for? They know that in half an hour, I'm not going to know 100% about you, right? At a very basic level, they're looking for a minimum pass mark in terms of your capability levels is one thing. So you need to have a minimum level you can demonstrate. And if you know something really well, then you should absolutely make sure that message lands across. Second is an interview is not an interview in isolation, right? Nobody is just doing a one-to-one conversation and saying, I'll take you. You might have done a test, a coding test, a DSA test, anything before. You might have a couple of rounds of interviews. So it's basis 3-4 data points together that people are actually deciding whether to hire you or not. Right. So every question in every interview is important, even if it's just a 20 or 30-minute thing. And the last piece, right? I get asked a question and I don't know the answer to this. Right. So sometimes the easiest one is to be frank and say, hey, I'm so sorry, but I don't know the answer to this question. But especially when I'm interviewing, and I've seen this a lot, right? I don't have an issue if somebody doesn't know something, because what I'm looking for is when they don't know something, how do they respond? So is it that I don't know, so I'll just give up? Nobody's going to hire it. Then if I don't know, I can do it in a couple of ways. I can tell you, see, I'll be very honest, I don't know this completely, but I'd like to give it a shot and you can let me know if I'm on the right track. So you'll be like, hey, the answer to this X is I'm thinking about it in this way. So if you'll explain your thought processing, I don't know this, but if I had to work it out, this is how I would work it out by saying ABC things. So that's one approach. And then the interviewer might correct you saying, okay, this makes sense, this doesn't make sense. The second approach is also to say that the interviewer asked you for a question on one topic, that you tried answering it. Maybe the interviewer says, I'm sorry, but that's not right. What you can tell them is, I'm so sorry, I think this is a topic I probably haven't known really well. But what I do know really well adjacent to this is XYZ thing. So, but you can't just say that the person has asked you a question on back end and you go back and say, no, but I know front end really well for a interview, right? So I think if I had to, again, shorten it again to one is, even if you don't know, it's important to try and not give up. And second is, if it's something you don't know, can you try and take that question saying, I don't know this, but I know this really well, which could also be useful for this role. It can take a negative experience and make it very positive for the candidate.
So it's like we have to show our intention of solving a problem, even when we don't know the exact answer for that.
Exactly. Intention and resilience, if I had to pick 2 words. Absolutely.
Yeah, sure. And there is one thing which I also hear a lot, that people giving this advice, like you have to steer the interview uh, according to your knowledge. Is that possible? Are interviewers so dumb to that they don't understand that this guy is doing this, or is it possible?
Yeah. So what I guess you're talking about is almost like a very advanced skill in interviewing, right? In the sense, how do I give an answer which automatically suggests to a person to ask the next question?
Yes.
So is it doable? Kind of, yeah. So I'll give an example, right? If the job description for the role is there and they've said there are ABC topics which we want people to know. And let's say your project uses some of those ABC topics in your project, right? Let's say the interviewer says, hey, I'm looking for somebody who's great at building certain capabilities in web pages. And that's exactly something you built in your project, right? I could tell it as simply as when they're asking, saying, tell me some of the things you've done at Masai school or when you worked in college, etc. I can talk about, hey, this is a project I built out. And I noticed in the job description that this is one of the things you're looking for. So I would actually like to talk about how I use this in my project. So, which means you're not trying to fool the interviewer. You can actually tell them directly that I think you're looking for this. I'm happy to talk about it. Right now, it's possible that the interviewer, if they want to stress test you, they'll be like, haha, no, let me talk about something else. Because if you go very strongly in a direction, one of the interviewers might say that, let me put this person in an uncomfortable position and see how they respond. Yeah, so it's possible, but the best way to do it is if you know your direction basis what the company wants, not just basis what you want. Because then you can find a sweet spot in your conversation.
So I feel like sometimes interviews ask some challenging questions to just put them in that stress levels and to check how they handle that.
Yep, and you're absolutely right. And if you think about it, right, and this depends on the culture of the company, the stage of the company, and the type of team. And again, I'm referring back to early stage startups. I think there's going to be a lot of speed, a lot of difficult situations. A lot of the time, you're learning along the way, and you might not have structured L&D program, learning and development. You might not have a structured training program. So a lot of the time, you're being asked to learn new things in a difficult environment. And if I had to test for that, if I know the company I am hiring for has a very intense environment, things happen very fast, then I want to bring that out in the interview. So I'll ask you a question. You'll be like, I don't know. Okay, but if you had to work this out, what would you do? And I'll keep asking 4 or 5 follow-up questions on that just to see when things get difficult. Do you say, no, this is all I can do? Or do you keep trying? It's a nice test to see in the real world when you're put in a stressful situation, how will you respond?
So this response is like sometimes the students like they respond to answer very quickly that interview can't catch. Like should they be like really answering in a really slow fashion? Like is there any good way of answering to questions?
Yeah, actually, that's a great
Giving
point.
pauses or something.
100%. And I can actually talk about this personally because a lot of the feedback I got whenever I was going through interview preparation is that you talk too fast. And when we talk to a lot of students, I still get that same feedback. And so I know that is my tendency. So if I'm talking to friends, if I'm talking to colleagues and we all speak fast, it's our comfort level. But when I'm talking to somebody new, I can't just follow my own speed. So I think that's a great point. So if I had to break it into a bit of a structure, right? One is when you're asked a question by the interviewer, the first question is, do you understand it clearly? So I think if you don't understand it clearly, the first thing to do is to ask clarifying questions. So you ask me a question on ABC. I'll be like, if you don't mind, can I just clarify 1 or 2 points on that question to ask you back? Right. And you're putting it politely so that the interviewer shouldn't feel I asked you a question, you're asking me a question back. So that's part one, clarify the question. Second is if it's a long and complicated question, right? Then just then asking, can I just take a minute to think about this? Right. And so you can take time to think and answer. You don't have to just spit out your answer. And second is if it's a long question, sometimes it just helps to say, if you don't mind, can I just repeat what I've understood on your problem statement? Right? It means that that person realizes that you're not just waiting to say whatever you know, that you're listening carefully and then answering back basis the question. So definitely worth pausing to take a thought. Second is clarifying or repeating what you understood about the question. And the third is while speaking, it's helpful to sort of gauge how the person you're talking to is. So if both of you have a great wavelength going and the person's understanding what you're saying, then you can try and maybe speak faster so that you're not boring the person. Right? If you go very slowly, they might be like, yeah, I know all this. Why don't you move faster? Right? But sometimes if you feel that, hey, my level in English is okay, but the other person is expecting or vice versa, then if there's any likelihood that the understanding is not clear, then it's safer to go slower. And the last piece I'd say is when you're giving a long answer, right? Like what I'm doing right now. It just helps to take a pause and say, hey, sorry. So I'm just going to pause here for you. Is there anything which is not clear or can I keep going? So that way, if you break it down, if I keep talking at you for 5 minutes, you'll stop listening.
Yes, understood. Anirudh. One last question I have. Like, so students build portfolios with a lot of effort. Uh, is there if is there like fancy portfolios get shortlisted or like readability you said? So how to making the portfolio as fancy as we can does really impact the get through of the to any interview like.
Got it. That's actually a great question, right? Because a lot of what I've been saying is generic. So if you were to take it and break it down to what specifically matters, especially for a lot of our students, right? When it is for software development roles. So I'd say 2 parts, right? One is the basic, which is required, and then what to do above that. So I think the basic, which is required, is making sure your readability is good. Again, no grammatical mistakes, that it's crystal clear, that you're not repeating the same thing 4 or 5 different times, because the portfolios are like how you present yourself, right? So readability is the most important piece, and making sure it's clean and decent aesthetics. The second piece then is functionality. It's like, it can't be that I clicked on something and it didn't work, or it's not opening up, or I got an error. So readability and functionality, I think, are the basic things which have to be there. Now, the second part, in terms of how fancy should it be, right? Honestly, this is where the personal customization comes in. Because let's say if I'm hiring for one type of company or a different type of company, they might have different philosophies on what makes a good design, right? So I think that's where the last part comes in, on how do I want to present myself. If I want to show my very creative side, then maybe it becomes a little more fancy. But if I want to say that, hey, no, I like a clean aesthetic and this is how I prefer simplicity, then your aesthetic might be more simple. But the only one thing I will say is that in the interest of being fancy, we cannot compromise on readability and functionality. Those two are non-negotiable. It's okay for it to be simple, clean, and not fancy. It's not okay for it to be fancy, but it doesn't work.
Awesome. That's understood. Like, even when we are giving our interviews, like some of us made really fancy portfolios, and they compromise readability when they do this stuff.
Exactly. Yep.
Cool. Thank you, Anirudh. That comes to the end of the session.
Thanks a lot,
Thank you so much for
Mandeep.
joining.
Absolutely enjoyed the conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you.